Good morning from our New York City studio. My name is Gad Lebanon and I'm Chief Economist North America here at the Conference Board. Happy New Year to everyone and welcome to our special webcast on the impact of demographic trends on consumer spending. I will introduce my colleagues here in a minute, but before that, let's go through a few webcast tips. So first of all, if you have any questions, no need to wait until the end. Please just type them on the chat box on the bottom left of your screen, and we will take them as they come. You can download the presentation via the file download pod in the bottom center of your screen. If you want to watch full screen, you can full screen the video or PowerPoint at any time by clicking the 4 arrows at the top right of your screen. If you have a minute at the end, we'll really appreciate if you can complete a brief evaluation so we can incorporate your feedback into future programs. And if you want to watch this program again or share it with colleagues, it will be available on demand after the webcast on our website. And stay tuned for conference discount offers at the end of this program. And now I know some of you are interested in CPE credits and they are available for this webcast. Please type your full name and email address in the space provided. There will be 3 OK pop-ups during the webcast. You have to click them and you need to stay online for the entire webcast. The CPE credit is available only for live webcast participation. So today with me here in the New York studio, we have Brian Anderson, who's Associate Program Director and is the muscles and the brains behind the report that we are going to talk about today. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Good morning and Happy New Year, everybody.
And I think on the first webcast at the conference board is John Forsythe, who is also the new leader of the Consumer Dynamic Center. As you know, the conference board is launching several new centers, and John, with a lot of experience in consumer-related topics, many years in McKinsey, he is luckily our new leader of the Consumer Dynamic Center. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Gad.
So what are we going to talk about today? In a minute I'll let John speak a little about to introduce the Consumer Dynamic Center. We'll talk about the project motivation and the timeline. It's a multi-stage project that some of you are familiar from earlier parts of it. And then we'll dive into the project itself, into the report that is expected to be released later this month. The main results focusing on national population and spending growth by category and region, and what we think are the business implications of those trends. So, John, if you want to take a few minutes to talk about the new Consumer Dynamic Center.
Thanks, Gad, and thanks everybody for joining us today. The conference board has set up to create 16 centers to make their research and expertise more accessible to you, their members. So if you go online and go to the web page, you can see these 16 centers out there. There are things like the Consumer Dynamic Center, Innovation, Digital Transformation, Communications and Marketing. And if you click on those, then you can actually access what webcasts they have coming up, what research they have issued, or other materials to make it easier for you to access all the wealth of expertise and research that we have available for you. Now, the Consumer Dynamic Center was created in recognition of the importance of the consumer or customer to some of our members. Not only are they important, but they're also changing, right, in this era of global trade and globalization, particularly with digital transformation. Our consumers are just changing how they behave, how they get information, how they make decisions, how they socialize with each other, and how trends are formed. And many companies have recognized that by trying to become more consumer-driven or customer-driven. And so, recognition of that, the Conference Board created the Consumer Dynamics Center. Now, obviously, we've been looking at the consumer for a while. Since 2012, we've had a joint venture which we continue to have with Nielsen, the Demand Institute, and this just builds on that. Now, here's some examples of the kind of research we've done just to illustrate that. The demographic trends is what we're going to talk about today. There's also work done in the past, very interesting, on the global digital consumer and the connected spender with that. We've also looked at, in conjunction with our China Center, understanding the changing China consumptions. These are all available if you go online and click on the web links to get to the material if you're interested. On the confidence, global confidence, consumer confidence is something that's a bit new for us, actually, and we're very, very excited about this. We have obviously been doing the U.S. confidence, as you might know. We're now going to be able to look at consumer confidence and create indices from some 60 countries globally. And you'll see more of that in the coming year. And lastly, we'll continue to do the short-term spending forecast that will come out on a quarterly basis. So a bunch of stuff that we're doing with the Dynamics Center, but let's now get to the meat of what you signed up to do with today. So, Gad, do you want to take us through the motivation? Yeah.
Thank you, John. And 2018 is going to be an exciting year for the center and for our consumer research, I'm sure. So what are some of the kind of the bigger picture and why we started to do this project? So as you all know, the U.S. economy is going through several very important demographic trends that are likely to shift the business landscape. And those demographic trends, many of them are simply aging of existing population, are highly forecastable. You probably heard me tell this joke before, but if you tell me your age today, with a high degree of certainty, I can tell you your age 10 years from now. And so those trends are very predictable, and also some of the changes in spending pattern are also pretty predictable over age, across ages, and also across different ethnics and racial groups. So essentially what we're doing in this project is we're marrying those two trends, the population projections for different age and ethnic race groups, and the special consumption pattern of those groups. And we're just asking what will happen 10 years from now if those are the only things essentially that are going to change in the economy. And so maybe surprisingly, but just those two things with high degree of predictability suggest major changes in consumption patterns in the United States. Now, for those of you who've been following our work, you probably remember that in early 2017 we already had one report on that topic, where we focused on age and more aggregate groups of consumption categories. The second report that we are going to feature in this webcast is adding a few layers to this original work. We are adding the race and ethnicity component, and we are looking at more granular products. So you'll see some very detailed products here. Especially, I can give you the heads up if you have any interest in hearing aids. You learned a little about that today. And we are expecting later in 2018 what we think is the final report on that topic, that first will update the population projections. The census is about to come out with a new 10-year, or actually more than 10-year, but we will focus on the 10-year projections, and we'll also use more advanced techniques, machine learning and other, to better understand the relationship between different groups of population and their consumption patterns. We'll also add the new information that we are going to study We're going to look at the Nielsen data that has that there are time scan data on items that can be scanned by consumers. And we're also going to look at the time usage, how not just how people spend their money, but also how they spend their time and how that is likely to change as a result of those demographic trends. So this is the big picture, and now we're going to start going into some of the main results in more detail, and I'll hand it off to Brian.
Great, thank you, Gad. So we thought we'd start with just a quick kind of summary of the findings, and I also would like to take this opportunity to talk briefly about the methodology that was used to derive these findings. Just want to make sure everybody's comfortable with what we're saying, what we're not saying, and how we got to these numbers. So Gad kind of gave a preview of some of the population projections in the US over the next 10 years that we're looking at here. Just to put some numbers around some of the big stories that he was discussing, we're expecting, or the Census Bureau, I should say, is expecting about 8% total population growth in the United States between 2015 and 2025. And what we've done is we've disaggregated that 8% into different groups of consumers. In the first report that came out early last year now, we looked only at the age of consumers and talked about how population growth is likely to vary across different age groups. And some of the key findings from that report really have to do with this story of baby boomers and millennials and the impact that those two generations are having or are likely to continue to have on the age distribution in the US. I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point, if you've paid attention at all to consumer news, that there's a lot of discussion about baby boomers and millennials, and people seem to generally understand that the population is getting older. But we view the actual numbers, as the magnitude of the numbers, as perhaps being a little bit surprising. So when we think about growth in the oldest consumer groups, looking at the groups between the ages of 70 and 84, over the course of the next 10 years, the population of those consumers is likely to grow by about 50%, so more than 5 times the overall average growth rate of population in the economy. And if you kind of combine everybody in that 65 plus age group, the sort of the traditional retiree age group, if you will, those groups all told will account for 70% of all the population growth in the country over the next decade. So we view that as a pretty staggeringly high number, and we want to make sure that everybody's kind of aware of what the implications are of that number that we'll discuss throughout this report. In this report that's to be released this month, we've added a second dimension to that population analysis. A lot of the questions we had from the first report had to do with, well, what's the impact of, say, the Hispanic population on these age groups, or how are these growth rates across different age groups, how maybe do they depend on different races and different ethnicities and so forth. And so what we've tried to do in this report is incorporate that dimension into the analysis to address those questions. And what we see kind of across the board, and we'll show you some more numbers around this in a couple slides, but really at all age levels, the so-called minority groups, Hispanic consumers, Asian consumers, Black consumers, et cetera, are likely to grow at much faster rates than white consumers will. And so when we look in total, the Census Bureau expects about only 1% total growth in white consumers over this decade, and that compares to about 24% total growth in Hispanic consumers and 24% total growth in Asian consumers and 9% amongst Black consumers. And then what's so interesting about the Hispanic consumers from the point of view of this work is that Hispanics have kind of the double whammy scenario of simultaneously being fast growing and a relatively large group of consumers already today. And so when you kind of compute the contribution of growth of the total population from Hispanic consumers, you find that over half of all new consumers in the US over the next decade will be from Hispanic origin. And so when we combine these sort of age and race and ethnicity dynamics together, we really see these two groups of consumers that really jump out to us as being the big drivers of population growth over the next decade. That's older consumers and Hispanic consumers. And so you'll see that trend or that theme kind of emerge throughout the rest of this presentation. So now, of course, the theme of this project is that not only do we know something about how the population is likely to change over time, But we also know something about how those different groups of people spend their money differently from one another, how they behave as consumers differently from one another. And if we just kind of combine those two things, marry them together, as Gad was describing earlier, we can get some interesting viewpoints on what's likely to happen to consumer spending over the next decade as these changes play out. And so just going over briefly here with some more detail to follow on some of the findings around consumer spending growth, that 8% population growth we talked about is likely to lead to about 7% total growth in spending for reasons that we'll talk about later. But one of the things I wanted to point out here is that we're literally only talking about growth or changes in that population count here. We're not accounting for, say, changes in household income. We're not accounting for changes in household preferences or any of those other not very predictable factors. This is really just meant to give that baseline of how spending is likely to evolve. So the 7% here we're talking about is in reference to that 8% total population growth. And then as I mentioned before, and you'll see the details in a couple slides, that total spending growth is really going to be driven almost exclusively by these two groups of consumers. We're going to call them retired white households. These are the older population of baby boomers that are retiring and will account for so much of the population growth. And then also the sort of working age Hispanic households, which are sort of the next largest, fastest growing group of consumers as well. And when we talk about how this spending is likely to evolve across different product categories, we are relying on this idea that if you have a product category where spending on that category is very highly concentrated within a group of consumers or within a group of households that is likely to be very quickly growing over the next decade, then spending growth on that category is also likely to be very quickly growing. And so we're able to sort of disaggregate that spending growth across these different product categories based off of how popular, if you will, any given category is with each of these consumer groups, and then we just kind of multiply all of those numbers by the forecasted growth rate of those consumer groups. And so really on the spectrum of category growth over the next decade, it really ranges on the high end with healthcare, which is, as I'm sure everybody is aware, very highly concentrated in older households, which are also the fastest growing group of households on one end of the spectrum, all the way down to education on the other end of the spectrum, which really is the opposite story. It's very heavily concentrated in the youngest consumers. And as you'll see in a minute, those are likely to be amongst the slowest growing group of consumers. So all the other product categories kind of fall in that spectrum in between healthcare and education. And then finally, we also look at how these differences are likely to vary across different regions of the country. Of course, when you think about baby boomers and retirement, you probably think about retirement destinations and maybe people moving away from cold climates to warm climates. And indeed, that's a story that has been very strong over the past several decades in the US, and one we expect to continue. And so a general trend that we've identified in this report is this continued migration of the US population from, say, the Northeast and the Midwest down to the South and to the western part of the country where it's a little bit warmer. And indeed, when you look at not just total population growth, but also how that growth varies across different groups of consumers in terms of race and ethnicity and age and so forth, and then you kind of redo that same math and combine it all with spending patterns, you get an array of census divisions based off of from the fastest growing to the slowest growing. The mountain division, this is the Utah and Montana and Nevada and Arizona and so forth, is likely to be the fastest growing division in the country with about 15% total spending growth. That's roughly double the national average. And then down on the other end of the extreme, you see the New England and the Middle Atlantic region, which will only have about 1 to 2% total growth in consumer spending over the next decade. So that's just some of the high level. We'll get to some of the more details.
Yeah, and the question here, how do you define the word consumer? I assume that data comes from the US Census data for people aged 18 plus. So actually, when we talk about consumers, we talk about households. And one of the part of our methodology is to take the census population projections that are done by age of individuals and translate it to projected growth of households based on the distribution of population in different age groups into households. So we're essentially covering all the population in the United States because they are all part of one household or another. So that's our definition here. Let me go through some of the main population trends that we are projecting. So what, not we, actually I should say the US Census, but we tabulate it in what I think is an interesting way. So what we have here, we're looking at the green line, or at the horizontal axis we have 5-year age groups. And the green line shows for each of them what is the projected growth rate between 2015 and 2025 of each of those age groups. And the blue bars, which should add up to 100%, right? Please let us know if it doesn't. The blue bars are the share of the total growth. So what percent of the overall growth in population comes from each of those age groups. So again, I think the major trends would not surprise anyone, but I think the magnitude is, because every time I show this chart and I tell people that the group between 70 and 84 will increase by 50% in those 10 years, it's really a surprising number, and clearly the main story of the population growth in the United States is in the older age groups. Millennials, they also have an important contribution. They are a larger part of the economy, so even though they have a significantly lower population growth rate than the older people, just because there are so many of them, they do have an important contribution to the overall growth rates. I think also something somewhat surprising here is that there are groups of population that will shrink over the next 10 years. So people between the ages of 50 and 60 essentially will, the number of those people will be smaller 10 years from now than it is now. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, many marketing companies, I think the generic target for consumers is 18 to 45 and with high consumption patterns and what have you. And I think that's why we hear a lot about millennials, because they fit right into that growth pattern. And so there's big growth there. And so for companies looking for growth, they should think about millennials. But I think the other issue here is, right, Gad, is don't forget about the baby boomers, right? Mm-hmm. There's still a lot of consumption going on of the older people, and it may be not as quite sexy to kind of, communicate to them and advertise to them, but there's a lot of spending going on.
Yep, they have a lot of money. So one of the things we are adding in this stage of the project is to look at different race and ethnicity groups. And there are interesting stories here as well. Again, what we have here are 5 groups: white non-Hispanics, black non-Hispanics, Asian non-Hispanics, other non-Hispanics, and Hispanics. So everyone is included in only one group. Again, the blue bars should add up to 100%. The green bars are showing the growth in each of those groups in the 10 years, and the blue is the contribution to the overall growth. So what is very clear here is how the white non-Hispanics, that are the majority of this country still, reaching the 62% in 2015, they are essentially not going to grow almost at all in those 10 years. Where we'll see most of the growth is in the Hispanic and the Asian and the others that are going to grow very rapidly, around 25%. And because the Hispanics are such a large share of the population, this large growth translates to more than 50% of the population growth in this decade will come from Hispanic. Now, it's important to note that those forecasts that we are now showing are based on population projections that took place before the new administration. And I'm sure many of you are looking at those numbers and are wondering, are we really going to see such a large increase in the Hispanic population? So the answer is probably not, and we're looking to see to what degree this is reflected in the new population projections. But Especially if you open the newspaper today and you see what's likely to happen to the El Salvadorian population in the U.S., this Hispanic projection, at least in the very short run, looks somewhat biased upwards. Here in this slide, we're kind of marrying both the age and the ethnic racial group. So each line is for a different ethnic race groups, and we also have for each line has a different number for different age groups. So they kind of have similar patterns, but some differences as well. So first of all, the white non-Hispanic is the group that almost every age group is growing the slowest. And Hispanics and Asians are growing the fastest, usually together with the other. One thing to also to note is that in certain age groups, the immigrants from recent decades that aged, so a lot of the growth that we see from the 50 to 60 or 65 age group is coming from Hispanic and Asians who immigrated to the United States in the past 25 years as younger people and simply aged in place. So that explains a lot of this growth. Kind of looking at it in a somewhat complicated, but I think very informative way, in another way, is this chart. So this again, the I would say purple line is the growth rate of each age group in total, and then we break it down to the three contributors to this line. So we have the positive contribution from, or usually the positive contribution from the different base size from the past decade. So how many people were in younger 10 years ago and grew in place. The red is the always positive contribution of net immigration. And the green is unfortunately always the negative contribution from death, which is not surprisingly concentrated in the older ages. So we see one of the interesting things here that there are groups, especially as the millennials age, some of the groups where we now millennials exist have a negative impact from their base size component. You see it 20 to 24 and 25 to 29. The kind of non-immigration impact is negative, but thanks to immigration of people in that age group, the overall growth rate is more positive. So that gives you the overall contribution of each of those components to the overall growth rate.
Yeah, there may be one other comment maybe we should make about methodology, and you guys are the experts, not me, so keep me honest here, is the other complication of immigration is, of course, assimilation. And in a bunch of categories, what first generation versus second generation versus third generation, consumption patterns may differ quite a bit. And I think the assumption we're making here is not that that doesn't go on, it's just that the average assimilation in these categories, whatever that might be, will stay the same for the next 10 years. This is something that in future work we might go and figure out how we can tweak that and what have you, but for the current work, that's the assumption.
Right.
And I think it's particularly important when looking at a chart like this, John, to your point earlier about focusing on that 18 to 45-year-old group. Really what we're saying here is that if you want to keep thinking about that group going forward, the face of that group is really changing quite dramatically, and without immigration contributing to a positive growth in the 20-year-olds age group, essentially, there would actually be a decline in that group. So yes, they are still a great growth opportunity, but there's a marketing challenge here to figure out maybe how we need to tailor our message to the new face of it.
We have a couple of questions that came along. One is, how do average household income correlate with the different ethnic groups? Trying to figure out the potential that each group represents, account for income levels and growth rates. So is this something that we directly talk about?
Yeah, so I think it might be either the next slide or the one after, we look at the level of spending that comes from each of these groups, right, which is obviously highly correlated with income, right? And so that's definitely one of the factors we take into account in this analysis.
Right. So I think this question will be fully answered in a few minutes. And then there's another question: are there any metrics indicating gender numbers within these groups? I guess the way I would ask it is, are there groups where it's very different from 50-50?
Yeah, so there is data on gender by age and projections. It's not something we've yet incorporated into this analysis, but it is definitely something that we will be adding to the final report to come later on this year.
Right.
Yeah.
I think probably the groups where it is significantly different from 50-50 is in the very older age groups where women are significantly more than 50%. But perhaps in some of I could be wrong, but in some of the groups of immigrants that come to the US, we have more men than women. I think
that's entirely possible for sure. Yeah, that's something we'll keep digging into.
Yeah. Okay, so Brian, you want to take us through the spending?
Yeah. So Gad did a great job of covering the highlights for the population growth, and now we want to think about how we transition that and some of the to spending changes, and some of the questions that we just got are a great segue into that. So first, wanted to go over some of the different dynamics that we considered in these calculations. So one here has to do with household size, and I think this is actually a really important slide, if you will, in terms of understanding a broad array of the dynamics going on here, and what results come from what assumption and so forth. So if we just start by looking at the slide, what we see along the x-axis is different age groups. Now, this is not age of people per se, this is the age of the head of the household. So this is where we talk about this translation that Gad described earlier between people and households. This is how we're bridging that gap here. So this is, as the age of the head of the household increases, what is the average size of that household for different race and ethnicity groups? And a couple things to point out here. One, I think the one that jumps out first is that Asian and Hispanic households tend to be the largest on average, and white and black households tend to be the smallest on average. And so as the population shifts across those different groups, that has implications for what's happening to the average household size if we are willing to assume that the household sizes within each of these groups stays constant over time, right? Which may or may not be the case, but that's one of the assumptions in this work. The other, not just is it the case that Hispanic and Asian households are larger on average, but that the degree to which they're larger varies according to age. And so what we see are two interesting stories. One is that amongst older households, Hispanic and Asian households tend to be quite a bit larger than the households of their white and black counterparts. And that has some interesting implications when we think about select product categories and how spending on those categories is likely to evolve. We mentioned healthcare as a preview earlier on as being one of the fastest growing categories. And really a lot of that has to do with the fact that white households tend to rely more on things like nursing homes and palliative care and hospice care and so forth as they age, as opposed to, say, living with their adult children, which is something that's more common amongst Hispanic and Asian consumers.
Well, Brian, actually, before we move forward, there's a question that could be important moving forward that I will pass to you. So the question is, do you have any data on accumulated Hispanic population shifts versus semi or unaccumulated projections over the next 5 years? I will give the question to you partly because I'm an immigrant myself and I don't understand the word accumulated. So I don't know if that's something you're familiar with.
That's beyond my vocabulary as well. I don't know.
So maybe if the person who asked this question, if you don't mind rephrasing it differently, so we will be able to answer that question. Do you want to guess?
Acculturated?
Acculturated, yeah.
So this would be the simulation.
Yeah.
It's the other side of this simulation point we talked about earlier. The assumption that we've made is that however that dynamic happens on how many first, second, third generation folks they are, however they then acculturate or assimilate into the U.S. and how that affects their changing patterns, how they do that and for what categories, we've assumed that's going to be constant for the next 10 years, at least in this research so far.
Yeah, maybe another way of saying that is what we're assuming is that the average behavior across say, acculturated and unacculturated Hispanics, whatever that average is today, will persist over the next decade.
Okay, so apologize for the pronunciation.
Sure.
There's another question that came in. It's easier for me, at least. Can you please clarify the definition of Asian? Are they permanent residents, green card holders, Asians who became U.S. citizens, a combination of both, or something else? So I think I know the answer to that. It's both. So anyone who participates is a resident in the United States at the time of the survey, so they could be even not permanent residents. It could be people who are on a student visa or something like this. So any person who is from an Asian race is considered Asian here.
That's correct, yeah.
Right. Now, illegal immigrants aren't probably in this analysis, right?
They are probably significantly underrepresented.
Yeah.
I don't know that they are completely omitted, but they are certainly underrepresented.
Yeah, it's really anybody that the Census Bureau counts, and there's a lot of research that suggests that they're not particularly good at counting illegal immigrants. So.
Yeah.
So beyond household size, that's one important dynamic that we look at. This gets back to the question from before about income levels. We do look at income levels across different groups, but really only insofar as how much of that income gets translated into consumer spending. So here we're plotting out, across different ages of the head of the household, and then for each race and ethnicity group of the head, what's the typical level of spending look like for different households? And really two dynamics appear. With respect to age, probably not surprisingly, it's the middle-aged households that really spend the most amount of money. They're most likely to have families, larger sizes, more people to support, more things to buy. That's not surprising. And then also, Asian and white households on average spend more than Black and Hispanic households do. So we're again assuming that those average values for each group stay constant. We're allowing the different growth rates of the different types of households to evolve over time, which will have implications for how the average level of household spending is likely to change. And so finally, if we just tie all those things together, like Gad's talked about before, marrying the population growth with the average behavior information from today, we can get a pretty interesting picture about how total spending is likely to change. So you may remember when we were talking about the summary earlier on, I mentioned that these numbers imply about 7% total household spending growth over the decade. And what this slide here does is it decomposes that growth in terms of the contribution that come from any one type of household, which is a combination both of age and the race and ethnicity of the head of the household. So all of these bars here add up to 100%. As Gad said, please let us know if you think otherwise. But that's the goal here, is for this to all add to 100%. And I think the two main takeaways from this slide, if there's two things to really focus on, it's the impact of these two groups that we've talked about so far. The older white households and the working age Hispanic households. Really, if you take the two black bars all the way to the right, and then kind of the 3 or 4 blue bars in the middle of this chart, and you just add up those 5 or 6 bars, you get almost 100% of spending growth over the next decade coming from those two broad groups of households. So that really is the main story here. So that's all at the national level. Now, of course, we've hinted before, we have the ability to decompose these results by different regions of the country as well as by different product categories. And so we wanted to touch on some of that at a high level. We're not going to have enough time to go into all the detail for all product categories or for all regions of the country, so I'll use this time to kind of plug the report that will be released in another week or two. We encourage everybody to download that report, to dig into the results, and really focus on the categories or the regions that you find most important for your business. So just at a high level, as I described again earlier on in the preview, when you take all these dynamics into consideration, not just how total spending changes by different household type, but how spending on all these different product categories also changes by household type, and you combine those with the population growth, you can get a disaggregation of that total spending growth across different product categories. And it looks something like the data that's presented in this slide here. So again, just as a baseline, 8% total population growth we're talking about here. That corresponds to 9% growth in the number of households, and that corresponds to roughly 7% growth in the amount of spending that comes from those households. And then that 7%, or 6.8% in this slide here, that varies across these different orange categories according to the data here, all the way from healthcare, of course being the star of these categories, fastest growing, down to education being the slowest growing. Now, a couple things to point out here, just at a high level. We're going to go into some detail on the healthcare category just to give you a flavor for the types of analysis that's presented in the report for all of these categories. But just quickly here at a high level, some of the main themes to take away from this. You know, of course, this all comes back to this idea that we've brought up before, which is that products or categories where spending is highly concentrated in the groups of households that are likely to grow the fastest are likely to have the most spending growth here, and that's what we're showing. There's, within each of these categories, as you'll see when we get to healthcare, there's still a lot of variation. So not all healthcare products will grow at 9%. Some healthcare products, for example, are more common with the oldest, fastest growing households. Others are more uniformly spread across the different spectrum of household types, so those would be slower growing. But some themes to take away here, in addition to these data, are, one, we talked before about the impact of the different household sizes on the results here. And one thing that's interesting that we see from this data is that the fact that some of the faster growing households tended to be also larger, so the Hispanic and Asian households tend to be larger on average, and those are some of the fastest growing consumer groups, kind of means that since those households are larger, they can accommodate a larger population growth without the same level of household growth that corresponds to that. So any product category that's more closely linked to the household as opposed to the person, so things like housing itself, things like maybe furniture inside the home, or cable TV subscriptions, or these types of things, they're going to naturally be driven more by those population groups, more by the population groups with the fastest household growth. So in this case, that would be white households and black households, which tend to be smaller. And then conversely to that, products that are more closely associated with the person, so maybe things like food or apparel, are going to be more driven by groups of consumers that have a higher population growth relative to household groups growth. So that would be your Asian and your Hispanic consumers would be disproportionately driving growth in those types of products. So that's just kind of a fundamental baseline to get started. Again, the report goes into much more detail on all these, and we wanted to quickly go through the healthcare category as an example. So we start by just kind of understanding what the typical level of healthcare spending is for each of these groups of households today. And we see the not surprising story presented on this chart, that the older the head of the household is, the more household expenditures there is on average from healthcare. And in particular, white households tend to spend even more on healthcare than the Asian and Hispanic and black households do, even at that higher age group. So when we take that spending level and again multiply by the population growth rates for each group, we can get the same type of math we've talked about up to this point. We can decompose the spending growth in that category across different groups of households. And so here we're looking at how spending growth in healthcare decomposes across different age groups. And of course, not surprisingly, you can see that the 65 to 74 and the 75 plus age group will account for almost 100% of all growth in healthcare spending over the next decade will come from those two age groups. But then the interesting thing is that healthcare is one example of a product which is not particularly evenly spread across different race and ethnic groups. And again, it really is older white households that will drive most of that spending growth. So you can see that all white households combined will account for about half of total healthcare spending growth over the next decade as well. So this really is an age-driven story here, more than a race and ethnicity story. And then finally, all these different healthcare products, lots of variation in growth across those different products as well, mainly because that chart that we showed a couple slides ago that showed average spending by age and race and ethnicity, that chart looks a lot different for each of these individual products. And so some of the fastest growing products within healthcare, things like hearing aids, Gad's favorite product from earlier in the webcast, or maybe care in a nursing home or so forth. These are the products that are really, even more so concentrated in those oldest, fastest growing groups. And in the case of, nursing home, as we've hinted at before, really concentrated in white households because some of the other groups tend to rely more on their family members for support during those age periods. And then
I would say also that this is an example not just to illustrate the situation in health-related categories, but this shows you the degree of granularity that we can get in other categories. So it's a pretty granular, and in the final report when we'll have also Nielsen data, it will be even more granular in some categories.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. And then just quickly to tie a rope around that, the other end of the spectrum, things like physician services, labs and x-rays, these are the slower growing because these are the types of products that are more evenly distributed across these different groups of consumers, so there's not the same concentration in the fastest growing groups. And then finally, quickly, not just decomposing these changes by product category, but we also look at how they vary across different regions of the country. So we've pulled out here just a couple of different regions just to give you a sense for the flavor of the type of analysis. Again, in the report, not everything's here, so I encourage you to check out the report. But two of the faster growing regions in the country are likely to be the Mountain Division and the South Atlantic Division. And you can kind of see how their population growth is likely to evolve across different age groups in this chart, and how that compares to two of the slower growing regions in New England and the Mid-Atlantic. And I think one thing, so they generally follow the same pattern of having large growth in older people, relatively large growth in what the millennials are doing, but it's kind of everywhere in between where there are some interesting dynamics across regions. And so if you look at the Mountain Division in particular, you don't see that trough after the millennial group. You see a pretty steady and flat population growth coming from some of the younger consumers in that division. And so that has interesting implications for not just the level of spending growth in the Mountain Division, but how that spending growth is likely to vary across different products, given that a disproportionate share of the growth will come from some of those younger people in that division. And then likewise, you can look at the same type of data by race and ethnicity for the same four divisions. Again, Mountain Division being very fast growing, a lot of that growth will be driven by Black and Asian households. On the other hand, the South Atlantic Division, one that's also very quickly growing, more of the growth in that division will be driven by Hispanic households and by other non-Asian, non-Hispanic, non-Black households than in the Mountain Division, right? So just pointing out that there's a lot of variation across different regions of the country, and we've taken into account all those dynamics in this analysis, and again, just really encourage you to dig into that report for more details on that. But then finally, this just kind of shows all 9 census divisions, what the total growth prospects are like for each of those divisions. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is driven not just by the level of population growth within each division, but by the composition of that population growth across different age groups, across different races and ethnicities, and also takes into account that some products are more or less popular to begin with in different divisions as well. So all those dynamics are taken into account here. The general trend of slow growing regions of the country in the north and the northeast, and faster growing regions of the country in the west and in the south.
I'll just mention that in terms of geographical granularity, in the first report and in the next report that will come later in 2018, we will have specific projections at the state and MSA, metro area levels. So it will be extremely granular, specific categories for specific metro areas.
Great, so I think that covers the findings we wanted to talk about from the report. I think we were going to kind of have a discussion now about what we view as what some of the implications of these findings are for your businesses. Yeah, so in the report, we really identify 5 key implications. Some of these are kind of like relatively obvious, but maybe there isn't particularly anything you can do about, but I still think it's worth discussing what the implications are. Others maybe are some things that may be surprising or that you haven't thought of before. So we think that one of the obvious implications to come out of this work is about how spending growth prospects will vary across different product categories. And we think there's a lot of things that businesses may be able to do about that. It's clear to say that you should transition your operation from a product that is maybe slower growing into one that's faster growing. But of course, that's not particularly practical for every company to do, right? Coke can't all of a sudden start selling healthcare products tomorrow because healthcare products There you go. See, so yeah, so this is actually a great point that we've tried to talk about in the past, right? So one of the things that I hope people get from this work is not just a product by product forecast for how spending is likely to evolve, but a broader picture for how themes of consumer behavior is likely to change, right? So as the population is aging, as healthcare becomes a bigger amount of expenditure and topic of conversation, you might expect other product categories to kind of pick up on some of those same trends, right? So Coke making healthcare drinks, for example, right? Or just like taking advantage of this general change to the zeitgeist of consumer behavior and knowing what's going to happen to that and taking action ahead of time.
Yeah, a couple things as I was looking at this. I mean, obviously, as everyone knows, it's easier to grow where there's growth, right? So all being said, you want to go the way the stream is flowing. That would be best. I think the second thing is obviously we're looking at 10 years, so it's not something that's going to radically happen next year. But as I think about companies and thinking about strategic planning, if they're thinking out 3, 5+ years, and they're thinking about how do I modify my portfolio of categories, what adjacent categories do I want to get into? Yeah, if you're a healthcare company, or even if you're a high-tech company, you might want to look at hearing aids, right, as one aspect of categories to take a look at as you think about where you want to be, in the future. I think the other thing that you can take a look at is there are very few categories that are black and white, age, race, ethnic consumption. It's all a bunch of where are the SKUs and where are the big differences, right? And you can look at your brands, look at your current products and understand currently today which ones are more susceptible. I think on more of the positive side, I think we can identify where are there some potential pockets of growth. I mean, obviously the assumption we've made here is that behavior is not going to change over the next 10 years. And we know it will, right? And we know a lot of actions and innovations of companies will make it change, right? I mean, coffee was not a terribly high growth category until Starbucks came along, right? Where's the next Starbucks for any of these other kind of pockets? So you can start to think about that, and going back to the themes you talked about, to think about, wow, where can I start to innovate? Where can I start to maybe target some of those growth opportunities going forward, thinking about, 5, 10 years out.
And I think to that point about identifying growth opportunities, that's kind of related to the second point that we have on these implications list as well, which is, kind of recognizing even if you're maybe in a not so great situation of being in a business that maybe makes one of these projected slower growing categories, there's a lot of variation across different groups of consumers, and what's likely to happen is that over the next decade or so, the types of consumers that drive whatever growth you experience in your business are likely to be different in the future than they are today. And so one of the examples that I found in doing this work that I thought was really interesting is motorcycles. When you look at the data on who spends money on motorcycles, you really see that it's almost all driven by middle-aged white households. And those are likely to be among the slowest growing groups of consumers. So the growth prospects for motorcycle sales are not particularly great. But if you kind of dig one layer deeper than that, you see that amongst the other people, there's really only one other group of consumers that spends any money on motorcycles at all, and that's the youngest Hispanic households. And those are likely to be a great growth opportunity. So even if your overall growth prospects are lower, recognizing that maybe the consumers that you need to focus on are changing from, in this example, the middle-aged white households to the younger Hispanic households, and then kind of tailoring not only your marketing techniques to communicate with them, but also tailoring the product itself, right? So maybe the demand that comes from those younger Hispanic households is different than it used to be in the past. So making different kinds of motorcycles to meet that.
Right. And I think in addition to changes in product growth rates, there will be changes in location growth rates, and that's there are very large differences in growth rate by location expected for different categories, and that's another. It's easier to grow where growth is, and that also applies not just to products but also to locations. And an extreme case of that is retirement destination. So there has been, after the Great Recession, there were a few years with almost no interstate migration. People were stuck in place, but in recent years we are seeing a recovery in that. People are again moving to retirement destinations. We call it here finding the next Myrtle Beach, because Myrtle Beach a few decades ago was a very small place, and now it's a huge metropolitan area, and a lot of it was because of it became a major retirement destination. So people who moved in first in Myrtle Beach made a lot of money, and trying to understand where the next retirement destinations evolve is, I think, very important. There is just not enough space in all the existing retirement destinations. They will have to spread, and we also talked a lot, not a lot, we talked some about it in the first report, and we'll get back to it again in the next report.
And then finally, just kind of wrapping all that together, it's important to think about what the implications for these trends are, not just on, say, what your consumer-facing business is like, but also maybe on your supply chain or on how you execute, maybe the human resources side of your business as well. So, from a supply chain standpoint, to Gad's point about regional variation, if most of your consumers are moving south and west, maybe you should think about, moving warehouses south and west if that's possible for you to cut back on shipping costs. Or if most of your workforce are baby boomers and are going to retire soon, you need to think about how you can replace them with a younger generation. And it's important to recognize that maybe the labor force needs of that younger generation may be different from the labor force needs of the baby boomers and so forth. So we view this as kind of a more holistic understanding of a broad set of changes influencing the business environment.
Right. And the labor market implications, some of you are familiar with our labor shortages work, so we did a lot of work on the labor part of this story. Any last comments or thoughts on the business implications?
Not for me. Do we have any questions?
Not in the last several minutes.
Okay.
So we're almost at the end of our time. Let me just mention a few more webcasts that you may want to join in the coming days and weeks. So first of all, tomorrow, if you want to see me again, I'll be in the Economics Watch, but this is a special Economics Watch because we're going to release our key findings from our C-Suite challenge. So there are a lot of interesting results there. That's tomorrow at 11 a.m. Next week, again, I'll be here for a webcast about manufacturing, a changing industry and workforce. We'll have a guest from McKinsey who will share their findings from recent projects and about the manufacturing sector. And on January 24th, this time I'm not going to be there. It's a window on China's economic and business environment. So for those of you interested in China and the risk or lack of risk in China, there will be plenty of talking about that on January 24th. So I want to thank John and Brian for joining me today in, I think, a very interesting webcast. And very soon, the report that we're talked about today will be available with a lot of granular information and more elaborate discussion. So please, if you're interested, you can access it as a part of the membership at the conference board. And this is a topic that we'll continue to work on, and later in 2018 we'll have even more information and conclusions on that topic. So thank you very much everyone for joining us, and please have a good rest of the day. Bye.